I'm Janet Boynes, your host from Healing and Made Free from Janet Boynes Ministries. Thank you for tuning in. I am going to be talking about struggling with addiction, alcohol, drugs, eating disorders, unwanted same-sex attraction, or even if you're somebody who is still living a homosexual life. Let me tell you something. I have survived all those things by the grace of God. I just want you to know that I am not a doctor. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychotherapist. I'm not a licensed counselor. I am an ordained pastor who just want to give you some really good tips on how God has set me free, how you can be set free, God's promises, what He has done for me, He will do it for you. If healing and freedom are what you want, you are at the right place at the right time. Let's get started. Welcome to Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes. I have my good friend, Dr. Weiss, on. Thank you for being on with me, Dr. Weiss.
Well, thank you for being here. I'm excited.
I'm excited to have you. You know, Dr. Weiss, you are fairly well known. I know you've been on the Dr. Phil, Joni Table Talk, Daystar. I mean, you've been on so many different shows, The Doctors. I mean, you're just getting around. But I think the subject that you talk about at Heart to Heart Ministries or counseling is huge in today's world. I know you have recovered from a sex addiction. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. My story is basically, I was conceived in adultery, so that's not a great start. And then my mom found that ended her marriage because she was married. And then she found another guy in a bar. His last name was Weiss. And then they had 2.5 children before they got divorced. And so I was put in foster homes for a while and then taken out. And she found a guy she was living with. And my mom actually introduced me to kind of pornography because she gave me this college textbook that had a lot of pictures in it on sexuality. She thought I needed to know about sex. And I don't think I was maybe 14 or something. And so that started a whole pattern of pornography, masturbation. Then I was sexually abused and then got into, sex with women constantly. Alcohol and drugs came into the mix. So when I got saved, radically saved, alcohol and drugs left, but sex addiction didn't. It stayed because it had different roots. And so those had to be dealt with. And so then, being a sex addict in Bible college is kind of confusing. And then when I went to seminary, I started getting accountable, and that's what broke the chain. And I've been free for over 36 years. I do a polygraph to verify that. So you can be free from any sexual behavior because we're neuroplastic, spiritually, emotionally, financially, sexually. And so we can decide where we want to go with all that. So been free for over 36 years, and we've written many books. We've been on Oprah and Dr. Phil, some of the things you mentioned. And, people fly and do intensives and they get free. And so people can get free.
You mentioned, that you have struggled with that for a period of time. However, you became a Christian and you still struggle with it. I don't want to let that go because there's so many people that are struggling with so many things and they think, okay, as soon as you give your heart to Jesus, things change. But you have to work towards or get the right help in order to be free. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, the resources change because, the Holy Spirit comes in you, but Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5:23 that I pray that you sanctify your spirit, soul, and body. Okay. And so addictions can be rooted in any one of those 3 areas. We've all heard the wonderful testimony of I got saved and I never did that again. Okay. That was rooted in your spiritual dilemma. Like my alcohol and drugs was me looking for God. So when I found God, I didn't need that. Right. But my sexual addiction was rooted in abandonment, abuse, and neglect. So I had to heal from that. Okay. So that's not 1 John 1:9, Jesus, forgive me, I'm sorry, and I'm forgiven. That's James 5:16, where you seek out another person and you confess your faults to another, and you go through a process of humbling yourself and growing and maturing out of an addiction process. And then some things are biological in your body. You have chemical imbalances and things like that that contribute to maybe your agitation or how you're using a substance or a process to medicate your life. And so sometimes you have to treat 1, 2, or all 3.
Right.
And that's we do an assessment to find out what's going on so we can help somebody pretty quickly.
And I like that you do an assessment, but can you also say the reason why you dabbled into pornography, sex addiction is because of the trauma that you endured as a child?
Well, the trauma was definitely part of it, but the pornography preceded it. And fortunately it did, because I was already bonded to female body types. I was sexually abused by a man. So it didn't take me in any direction because I was already bonded to the female image, so it didn't take me down another road. Where with some people, if their sexual trauma is first, that can set up an appetite and sexual reinforcement, especially if it's ongoing abuse, for desires in any direction. Because once you start having even if you don't want the encounter, like so many people are sexually abused, it can still set up a template for sexual reinforcement in that direction, no matter what direction it is.
We are talking to Dr. Weiss from Heart to Heart Counseling. Dr. Weiss, I know in a lot of your counseling sessions, you have different types of sex addictions. One, can you expand on that? And can you mention the 6 types? I believe there's 6 types.
Yeah. Well, I'm the president of the American Association for Sex Addiction Therapy. So we actually train therapists, pastors, and coaches all around the world to get certified in this. So the model that we use is a 6-type model. And it just seems to be really effective, because we talk about number 1, the biological. That's the ring the bell, feed the dog. Because when you have any sexual experience, you get the highest level of endogenous opiates, hits the prefrontal cortex of your brain, and boom, whatever you're looking at, you actually attach to, you hunger for, you crave, and your brain wants to repeat. And if you keep doing that again and again and again, you can actually hijack your sexual attachment to an object, to a toy, to a thing, to anything. Okay, I can tell you hundreds of crazy stories, but that's ring the bell, feed the dog. And most people, and I assess mostly men, but women as well, if they have a biological sex addiction, they have a high frequency of masturbation and attachment to the object world, boo boo mommy, boo boo daddy, whatever. And so they ring the bell, feed the dog. And so it could be just as simple as that. The person who grows up in a great Christian home, never had anything said or done wrong to them really, but they ended up going into like the Sears catalog or pornography, and they start doing that, and they got ring the bell. And so their sexuality starts going down James 1:15, first lust, then sin, then death. Okay.
Exactly.
And so it moves them down that trajectory. And so that can be independent of their parenting. So you have the biological, you have the psychological, that's the soul realm, where there's been abandonment, abuse, neglect, and the soul is looking to be nurtured or celebrated or wanted, or encouraged or nurtured. And so instead of going to God, they go to the pornography because it's there, and they make up fantasies about being wanted or powerful or strong or whatever it is that they're trying to compensate. But in the same process, they're reinforcing the chemical message as well as the emotional message. And so they can be really addicted to both. The spiritual addict we talked about, that's someone who's looking for God in all the wrong places. And church history is full of these stories where someone gets saved and they're done. They stop being a whoremonger. They're just done.
Yeah.
Okay. And so those are great stories, but that's not most of the stories.
Right.
And then there is the sexual abuse sex addict. And that's someone who was sexually abused in a certain way, and they keep repeating exactly the same behavior as the abuse, either as the victim or as the perpetrator.
Right.
And so they're kind of in a kind of a cycle of repeating the trauma, and that's what they're kind of addicted to. The next one takes a little explanation, Janet, and that is intimacy anorexic sex addicts. So they have a sexual addiction, but with their spouse, they're intimacy anorexic. They're too busy for them. They blame them. They withhold love, withhold praise, withhold spiritual, withhold sex. They're not willing to talk about their feelings. They use anger and silence as a way to control. Sometimes they control around money issues, but the spouse feels like a roommate. They feel married and alone. And that is so painful for the spouse, but this is one type of sex addict. The last type is the mood disorder sex addict. This is a person with a sex addiction who has chemical depression, chemical bipolar, chemical manic depression, and they are using sex as a way to try to chemically balance their brain. Okay, so those are the 6 different types, and people can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or all 6. Okay, usually no more than 5, but and sometimes it's pretty complicated. And I sit with a guy, and in 15 minutes I can say, oh my gosh, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That's why you haven't gotten better so far, because all you're doing is looking at number 1.
You were talking about so many different things. I want to piggyback on something that you said as you continue to talk about, these sexual addictions. How do these sexual addiction tie in with rape? Can a lot of this tie into men or women raping,
absolutely,
not only their spouse, but also, children or men or whatever?
Well, again, it goes back to the reinforcement. Okay. Most people with sex addictions are never pedophilias. There are a group of pedophilias who are sex addicts, But like, so if you take any normal human brain and you start exposing them to child pornography and they start sexualizing children, and they do that chemically reinforcing thing and start sending images, well, their moral code breaks down because they've already done it. Okay. And so if they start looking for a victim, they could become sexual criminals. They also could become sexual victims where they go looking to be used.
Right.
Okay. Getting into some kind of sexual behavior where they are, tortured or used or somehow objectified, or they can become porn stars because, they're objects. They don't see themselves as souls anymore. So sexuality is the most powerful thing we possess, Janet. So when we attach it to something, either through our own experiences or through being traumatized, it can change the whole course of your life. Okay, especially if it's a secret. And I would tell anyone in your audience that if you've been traumatized, you've been raped, you've had an abortion or things like this, and you've never told anybody, you not telling anybody is causing a lot of pain for you. Because what you're going to find is love and compassion and someone who understands you. Just pick a compassionate person or a professional and tell your story, what really happened. And then healing and freedom can happen so that you don't have to have your life kind of driven by this trauma.
Dr. Weiss, as we're talking about, sexual abuse, I know I was raped by one of my mother's 4 boyfriends at the time, or 4 men who fathered her 7 children. And I kept that inside me from the age of 13 all the way up until I was 21. And my mother passed away in 2020. Do you know, at the age of 64, which is now, and I hope I don't start crying, I'm just now dealing with that trauma. I am getting EMDR, but it took from the age of 13 till 64 for me to finally realize, now that my mom's passed away, I'm not taking care of her. It's time to take care of myself, because I started going into a depression when the pandemic happened. All those thoughts started really infiltrating my heart and my brain. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate the courage of you doing that, because a lot of people die with those secrets. And like we have something here at the office called Cereset, which is a neuromodulation, because trauma affects your physical brain. You can actually get stuck in flight, fight, or freeze, and your brain can actually get stuck there for decades. And this helps it soften. But the sooner the better. If someone is listening and you've never told your story, that's why God sent us to you today. Go tell your story. Call somebody, let it out, because it's not your fault. You didn't make it happen, and you need to let someone know that what happened. I can tell you probably 1,000 people have told me the first time, because I was willing to ask in my assessment. And I don't ask, were you sexually abused? I ask, what was your first sexual encounter, hand, vaginal, oral, with anyone? And they say, oh, I was 6, or I was 9, or I was 12. Well, how old was the other person? Oh, they were 24. Okay, that's a felony.
Exactly.
Okay, that happened just this week. I told a lady was telling me her story. I go, now you realize that's a felony? No, I didn't realize that. Yeah, that's a crime. What happened to you here at 16 and they were 21, he would be in jail. He took her to a place and just raped her. Okay.
So Dr. Weiss, you knowing that, and pardon me for interrupting, but when you speak about, somebody, molesting or raping somebody at a young age, when is it our responsibility, your responsibility, my responsibility as a, credentialed pastor to report this? How important is that?
As a clinician, you're going to have to report it. As a pastor in most states, you are obligated to report it. And I would, any pastor, professional, or ministry person should know the law about that. But if you're an adult and this has happened to you, it's your responsibility to report it. Okay. Exactly. And now I would probably call the police department, our lawyer, and say, what's the statute of limitations? Or just put, rape statute of limitations in your state government page and see what pops up. Because some states it's 3 years, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, and some states haven't, it's as long as you want to. So it may not be reportable in some states where, if it's a 7-year limitation, but reporting it or not reporting it, really, that's a separate issue than telling somebody.
Right.
The first step is telling somebody, healing from it, and let yourself be free. And don't let your sexuality be defined by your perpetrator. Your sexuality should be defined by God Almighty. And he says you're clean. He says you're well. He says you're whole. And so believe his word, not the word of your perpetrator, who was a criminal. You don't believe criminals for any other thing in your life. Why would you believe a criminal for your
Right.
sexuality?
So, Dr. Weiss, I'm gonna go into this, but let's talk about marriage. We know that sex is a good thing within the marriage
Sure.
between a man and a woman. However, I've talked with some women who say, I was raped by my husband. It was no
Sure.
longer just consensual. In a marriage, how do you determine what's consensual? If somebody comes to you and say, I was raped in my marriage, if it goes to court, they were saying, well, you're married. How can you be raped? Is there such thing as being raped in your marriage?
There is, but I think you really have to parse that out. Okay. You'd have to go into that set of circumstances and find out what was really being done and said, because some people, that has to be really parsed out before you would go report that. If you feel you've been raped, you can report it, and then the police officer will determine whether that was a rape or not. Okay. But if you feel like you've been raped, I definitely would go to counseling for it.
Right.
And that's a significant violation. I had someone in my office just recently. That's what happened. And the guy was a sex addict, and he didn't know was not the answer he wanted, and he just took advantage of her and raped her. And that can be an ongoing experience for people.
Right.
Now, but there's the other side of sexual abuse in a marriage, and that's sexual neglect, where you don't show up sexually.
Right.
Okay, you're not giving your heart during sex. You're just laying there, or your eyes are closed, or you're fantasizing about something else.
Right.
And that form of sexual neglect is traumatizing too. The man or woman who can only have sex but never made love to for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, they've experienced sexual trauma. Okay, now can they report that? No, because neglect isn't in the law.
Right.
Okay, abuse is in the law. And so sometimes we only look at the side that is over here, but the man or woman who either they're not having sex, or the spouse rejects them, or their husband or wife is over there taking care of themselves with pornography for 3 to 5 years, or 10 years, 20 years. And that's sexual abuse as well. And so a lot of people who in your audience who might be experiencing intimacy anorexia or living a sexless married, we have a DVD called Sexless and Married, and it goes through like the different reasons why that could be happening. But that's abuse and neglect too.
Right.
And sometimes we don't have an ear for that. Well, you haven't had sex for 5 years. I really feel sorry for you. Oh, I was raped. Oh, we need to do something about that. Both are trauma and both are abuse. And so when I talk about this, I'm really clear about both sides of abuse, because some people, in the Christian world, they get even divorced because of the neglect abuse, not because of the abuse.
Right.
And
I've
those
heard that
people
too.
who get divorced because of neglect, we don't get them. Oh, if your husband beats you, well, we totally get that. Okay. But you've been neglected as a man or a woman for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Oh, well, you weren't trying hard enough.
Right. It's most definitely happening out there, for sure.
It's definitely happening.
Those of you who are listening and to Dr. Weiss talk about, sexual addictions, that's what we call it, healing and made free. We want you not only healed, but we want you to be set free. Dr. Weiss, there are, people that are going to watch this show who struggle with sexual addiction. I know you talk about the 5 commandments. How does one start to get free if they know they're sexually addicted, and can they contact you?
Yeah, they can definitely go to, we have drdugweiss.com. They can do there. There's a free newsletter. There's an app for them that's free that they can start doing that. The 5 C's are: pray in the morning, ask God to keep it clean, read literature related to sexual addiction or healing. 3, be in a group. You heal as a team. Men make men, women make women. You heal as a team. You don't heal by yourself. Okay. That's the biggest mistake most people make, is they try to do it by themselves and they fail for 25 years. Right. As soon as you get in a group, you start healing, because you start being honest and accountable. Okay. Let's see, pray, read, call, make phone calls to guys in your group or ladies in your group every day for the first 90 days. Don't try to take this on. The devil is bringing the whole team, and all you're showing up is your little water gun. Okay. You need a team.
So true.
You don't put one person on a football team. Okay. And expect to win. Right. But that's the way Christians do sexual healing. Right. They don't do it as a team. They do it independently. And that's why they fail so often. And then lastly, pray again. Thank God for keeping clean. They can put a rubber band on the wrist if they're struggling with objectification or intriguing. I have a whole video on intrigue addiction, where they're getting hits off of everybody, but they're not doing anything bad. Right. So they can use a rubber band, snap that, start confessing the word of God. That can be a start of that. But yeah, we have 50 groups that they could join, on the phone and get accountable no matter where they are in the world. There's the 101 freedom exercises. And there's also all the partner stuff. We're talking a lot about the addict, but the partner suffers. And we've got books and materials and groups for them too, because they're traumatized. Our research shows, we have a book called Partner Betrayal Trauma. 140 women did this research and about 9 or 12 scales. 3 different groups, Janet. Number 1, those who experienced infidelity. Number 2, those who experienced sex addiction from their husband. Number 3, those who experience intimacy anorexia from their husband. And you would think those are 3 different populations and the scores would be all over the place and there'd be this big variance. They were within 1% almost on every scale. Because it's not the trauma, whether it's abuse or neglect, it's who does the trauma. Because when you're one flesh, you don't have protection.
Exactly.
You don't have protection from neglect and you don't have protection from abuse. And so the symptoms of trauma, PTSD, depression, lower self-esteem, lower sexual self-esteem are exactly the same across the board, whether it's neglect or abuse.
Dr. Weiss, you have many men, it sounds like, maybe more so than women, that come to you. Not that women don't, because right now it just seems like, more women are dealing with sexual addiction as well, and pornography, really, because we hear a lot about it.
It really is. Women are growing. I have a book called She Has a Secret and a workbook called Secret Solutions for Female Sex Addicts, and they can get help as well. There's absolutely help for them. And that book has a lot of research. So I think about 40 women helped me write that book. And so, the number of women watching pornography in college and Christian colleges has gone up so significantly because of
the internet. What do you think that is?
Well, it's availability. Good girls wouldn't go into a porn store, when we were 20, right? They wouldn't do that, right? But all they got to do is open their phone.
Open your phone, yeah.
And they click a couple buttons, go, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. Oh my gosh, I'm here for 3 hours. Right.
And I hear that too, especially from men that, contact our ministry because they're dealing with, same-sex relationships. And they said they get out of that, but porn, they are struggling with. It's almost like they can't get it out of their brain, or what they see, it's always there. And that's what they wind up going back to.
Well, that's usually the primary addiction. That's the mistake. Okay. So that's an assessment issue. So when I do a masturbation history, porn history, and then their sex history, okay, so I'll have a guy, maybe he was married for say 10 years and he saw 15 prostitutes. Okay, that's 15. But in that same 10-year period, he masturbated maybe 950 times to pornography. And before he was married, he masturbated 10,000 times. So the primary addiction statistically is masturbation and pornography. It's not prostitutes. And so sometimes the therapist can get kind of a frisbee thrown at them and go, oh, that's really bad. Let's talk about that. That's not the monster. The monster is this thing you're doing 3 to 5 times a week that's feeding you to go out and do the other thing. Okay, so if we kill this over here, then the whole thing of going out and finding someone else will stop. But if they go back to, okay, I'm going to stop seeing other people, I'm going to go back to pornography, that's going to feed lust, sin, and death, which has to manifest itself because you're planting a seed. God has never violated the principle of a seed. So if you plant lust, you will eventually get sin and death unless you stop the process. Okay. So these are the guys who they're thinking, well, it's bad that I go out and hook up with anybody, male or female. And then, but I can do porn and that's okay because that's safe. No, that is that's the fuel that's leading you back to the fire. You gotta take the fuel and disconnect from the fuel so that your brain can heal, your spirit can heal, and your soul can heal. Because if you keep drinking poison, you're going to keep getting poison as results.
Exactly. We are talking with Dr. Weiss from Heart to Heart Counseling. Dr. Weiss, I have a few more questions before we go. When we talk about marriage, because I think marriage is so important and the enemy is attacking our marriages. When someone comes to you, as a couple and say, hey, my husband or my wife is dealing with pornography, are many marriages restored, or are there women or men just saying, you know what, I'm done, I can't do that? For me, I don't know what I would do, but I have trust issues, so I don't know if I could continue on, but
most do. Like in a 98% chance they can get over the pornography, masturbation, and the affairs and prostitutes, that's a little harder, but even in there, we're in the 90% of recovery. There's grace if someone is really willing to do the work. If they're not willing to do the work, it doesn't matter what the behavior is, the spouse will probably exit because the person is really married to the addiction, not married to them.
Right.
And that becomes the crisis of who they love, honor, and protect. right? Because what a man or woman protects is what they truly love. If they're protecting the addiction, that's what they love. And the spouse knows that. And so they might exit because they're unloved.
How important is the transparency with couples that are dealing with that? As a wife would say, you know what, I want to see your phone. You know what I mean? Should the husband just hand it over and say, here, go ahead and look at it and not argue about it because he needs to rebuild that trust? Or
Oh, absolutely. There's no reason why someone can't look at your phone.
Yeah.
Right. Or your desk or your
Well,
car.
I know
now,
some
if the wife is being
relationships.
obsessive about it, that's different.
Yeah.
But, there's nothing wrong with if someone said, Doug, can I look at your phone? Well, yeah, you can. And it's really good to have porn blockers, so there's nothing that's showing up. But, there's junk mail that people get and all kinds of stuff. But if you're managing that, there should be no problem. My staff looks at my phone all the time.
Yeah. When looking for a counselor or somebody to assist you with sex addiction, what should people look for?
Well, they should probably go to aasat.org because those people have been trained. Now, I did my own research. I went into like the top maybe 8 or 10 cities and I typed in sex addiction counseling or therapy. And I would go pages of people saying they treat sex addiction and there's no training. There's no certification. All they did is put it up there on a website because they need the money, but they don't know how to actually treat sex addiction. So make sure that they're certified in some way. And if they go to asat.org, they're going to find people that are very friendly with their faith and not going to get bad advice or secular advice. And they're going to be able to get what we talked about, the 6. We also do polygraphs, someone who's trained in doing that. So they're going to get the help they really need as opposed to experimenting. Because when your marriage is online, you don't want to go to a novice who read a book. You want to go to the people who wrote the book, right? Okay.
Exactly. I am so excited that you decided to get on the show, Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes. Those of you that are watching this podcast or listening to this podcast, this is not Janet Boynes Ministries' expertise. This is Dr. Weiss's. Please reach out to his ministry. Dr. Weiss, what is the name of your ministry and how can people reach you?
Heart to Heart Counseling Center, 719-278-3708, 719-278-3708. And they can go to Dr. Doug Weiss, DrDougWeiss.com. And in there is all the resources on marriage, on sex addiction, on intimacy, anorexia, on partner betrayal trauma. All of that's there. And they can tap into that and start a life of being free.
Dr. Weiss, thank you so much for being on Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you so much for listening to Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes. I want you to know that God is no respecter of persons. What he's done for me, what he has done for those that are guests on this show, he will do it for you as well. If you are struggling with anything, please do not hesitate to reach out. We will do our best to assist you in any way that we can. Please go to my website, janetboynesministries.com. We love you, but most importantly, God loves you. I hope you have a blessed day.